Today's topic is Mother's Day. We're going to discuss challenges mothers faced over different decades, self-care, and more. We have a very highly esteemed panel with us today. Lacy Pruett is an author and yoga teacher, passionate about healthy living. She's a former Mrs. Texas and lives in the Dallas, Texas area with her husband, Barnes, and her 2 dogs. She also has 2 grown-up stepchildren and participates in animal rescue efforts. Susan Lowe, a previous behavioral health compliance officer, currently works as a psychology instructor, licensed psychotherapist, and author. She honored her mother with her first book, Josie, A Story of Faith and Survival. Her second book, Josie Dreams of Freedom, is under contract. Susan is a first-generation American on her mother's side. Anna Penenberg is an author, mother, and healer working with individuals affected by trauma. Her practice integrates neurobiology, psychotherapy, and wisdom traditions. Anna's memoir, Dancing in the Narrows, is about a mother-daughter multi-year odyssey through illness and self-discovery. She lives in Topanga, California. Dr. Veronica Slaughter is a first-time author. Her debut book, Have You Seen These Children?, is a memoir of her childhood. After achieving the American dream, she is now retired after 36 years of practice and living on the beautiful island of Maui. Patty Sisco, pen name Elizabeth Silva, is the author of Another Cheesy Family Newsletter, a memoir that contrasts her lighthearted annual holiday newsletters with the dark reality of a family grappling with dreadful addiction and mental health issues. Her story is one of survival and determination in light of difficult circumstances that sometimes seem impossible to overcome. Rebecca Bischoff is a speech-language pathologist and writer who lives in Idaho. Her debut novel, The French Impressionist, received an Idaho Author Award in the Young Adult category. Her most recent novel, The Gravedigger, is a historical middle-grade story. A humorous middle-grade novel, Hole in the Rock, is being released next year. Welcome, everyone. Deciding whether or not to have children is an important life decision, and sometimes it can be difficult to know what our path should be. How did you make your decision to either have or not have children?
I grew up in an era when that was an expectation. Back in the day, in the 50s and so on, most of us aspired to be wives and mothers. And so that was just my expectation. As it turned out, after college, and I established my career as a teacher, I wasn't in any hurry, but I knew that someday I would have one or more because I was an only child and wanted to have children. But I was totally unprepared, and I didn't really plan to have any, but it just happened. As it turned out, I ended up raising 6 kids.
Oh my.
Oh.
On the other hand, I never wanted children. I knew growing up, I took care of my youngest brother. And so, my book, Have You Seen These Children? We were taken. So kind of a turbulent childhood. So I thought, I really don't want to have children. As it turns out, I had an unplanned pregnancy, and he is now 33 years old and the love of my life. And I always say to people, he picked me because I didn't pick him. It wasn't something I was consciously trying to do, and it turned out to be amazing. So I had no plans. And sometimes, what is it John Lennon says, life happens when you're busy making plans.
Yeah.
Well, my husband and I had been dating for about 3 years before we got married. And then maybe a year into our marriage, we started thinking about wanting a child. He had graduated from college, but I had not reached my educational goals. So we had a discussion about how we were going to make this work. And although we had some plans, I would, instead of taking day classes, take night classes, so he would be home with our child. It was difficult to, juggle school. I worked part-time with home and a new baby who didn't come with instructions.
Yeah.
But we made it work, and my son is a blessing.
Yeah. You know, I was also kind of raised with the expectation that when you grew up, you would marry and you would have children. And so I always had that in mind. And I was really excited about that, actually. I was thrilled at the thought of having children one day. And as luck would have it, I ended up being one of those fortunate individuals who got to deal with infertility. And so I guess my experience was a little bit different in that we struggled for a number of years before finally having our first child. And then we struggled again for a few more years and finally had our second. But I would just say those babies really do not come with instructions. And you need a new instruction book for every new age they enter.
Yeah.
It's true. Yeah.
How old were you when you had your children? Because I was 35 when I had my child, so I was already done with school and ready to become a doctor, and so it had its own set of challenges. But
I was fortunate because I had already also finished school. I was working as a speech pathologist. My husband wasn't in school either, and so in a way that was easier for us. And so we didn't have to deal with juggling all of those different things at the same time. So, and I was older. I was 33 when I had my first child, and then 38 when I had the second one. And so in some ways, maybe it was a little easier. In other ways, a little harder physically. I don't know.
Yeah, I was 34 when I met my husband, and we were both involved in our careers by then. And on my honeymoon, I got pregnant, and that was a little bit of a surprise. And so my first daughter was born when I was 36, and at 38, after I had actually an ectopic pregnancy in the middle there, and I wasn't supposed to get pregnant, and then I apparently did in the same month. So my due date for my youngest daughter was my first daughter's birthday. And so they're only 10 days apart, 2 years and 10 days apart. And it was a lot to raise two children that close together with a very busy husband in his career. And they're pretty close.
Well, for me, when I met my husband, he came with 2 children already, and they were early teenage years. And as we went through the dating process and he wound up proposing to me, I became very aware that I was going to be a part of this blended family concept. And I think I was a little scared. I was fearful of, all of the stories I used to hear about blending families, and that it was difficult, and I was going to be typecast as this certain type of stepmom. And a lot of fear came over me, and we had a lot of discussions about having our own children. But I was the one that said, no, I don't think it's for me. Let's get married. Let's start this new family. Let's do this. I love my husband very much, and it's all been worth it, but it's been a challenge. And I truly just never found time to prioritize adding to the mix. I feel like my plate's already been so full. And my background, I think I grew up a lot similar to a lot of you. I just figured it would happen someday. I would get married, have children, and it just kind of happens on autopilot. But the truth of the matter is it didn't for me. And I'd always focused on my career and just never made that building a family a priority. And as we went through our life and our marriage, it's so full that I didn't feel right. I knew it was my husband's wish not to have any more children, and I didn't really feel strongly either way. So it made sense not to go there. And that wasn't a hard decision for me. What was challenging was the criticism that I got through the years over just making the conscious decision not to be a mother in this life. And I didn't realize it was going to be that way. So it's been challenging, but the actual decision of not being a mom, fairly easy for me.
Yeah, I could see that. I don't know why this is 2020, for goodness sake. Where's the criticism coming from?
Yeah, I was surprised.
Well, I think that's something a lot of women run into with social media now as well. It's it's so common to worry about what other people are doing and then kind of compare yourself to others and then think, oh, I'm not doing this right. And it's so easy for other people who don't know you to tell you, well, you should be raising your kids this way, or you should be living your life this way. And that's quite a trap we often fall into.
They say that comparison is the thief of joy. I think that's very true.
That's very true.
I wanted to say that, the decision to have children, it's very complex. It's very, very individual. Depends what your experience is, even as a child sometimes, often. And whether you feel supported, whether you have the finances, whether it just happens to you. But either way, motherhood and parenting are really two different things. Mm-hmm. And when the baby comes without a manual, it's because there is something called parenting and you haven't ever done it before. And then there's a lot of learning that takes place, and it takes place because maybe you pursue finding out more about good parenting skills. Maybe you have friends. Maybe your child teaches you a lot because of their personality. And if somebody comes to me in my practice, these are the kinds of discussions I would have if that's a question for them, whether they want to embark on having children and want to make that decision.
Mm-hmm. I'm raising grandchildren, so I learned a lot through going through one round of kids when the second round came along. And especially the biggest lesson that I learned was don't sweat the small stuff.
Right.
Because I used to worry about the stupidest stuff about whether the kid's hair looked like I wanted it to, or they had these shoes on, or, things that just really didn't matter. So in a lot of ways, raising 3 extra kids has kind of been a blessing for me.
So the next question is, what challenges do you think mothers faced in preceding generations versus today? Do you think in some ways it was more difficult and in others easier for them? And how do you think it affected how they parented?
I think it depends on the time and location that you were born in, probably. I know my maternal grandmother in 1944 had her 2 children pulled out of her arms, a 4-year-old and a 12-year-old, and they were sent to concentration camps. So the children had a block of time of probably around 4 years where there was no parenting. They were just on survival mode. And as a result of that, my mother, although a loving woman, had a lot of trauma that she brought with her into parenting that certainly molded her version of it. And I was really thinking, just as I was talking, that there's some generational layover from that, in that I can think of times where I had to work really hard not to be a helicopter parent and hover over my son, but I was anxious about his safety, and I know where that comes from.
What's a perfect parent anyway? We all have different histories, different backgrounds. I'm an immigrant. My mother came to this country. She made $1.25 an hour. She's very well educated. They had the glass ceiling. She couldn't make very much money. Women just one generation ago, I think it was a bigger struggle. She was raising 4 small children when she finally found us. 4 small children as a bank teller at Bank of America, because when she told them she had a double master's degree, they wouldn't hire her. So she started putting on her application that she was a high school graduate, and she got hired right away. So it's kind of sad, just one generation. I mean, in my mother's lifetime, women couldn't even vote. So I see financially, especially if you're a single mom, financially it was much harder for my mother's generation, I think.
I agree with that. My mother was trapped in a bad marriage, but she was a high school graduate, but she had no skills, no way to support me. So I agree with that. I think the lack of opportunity for women back during their time really put a heavy bind on mothers and, you know, trying to raise their kids, especially single mothers. And a lot of them probably did stay in bad marriages simply because they couldn't support the kids.
We call it golden handcuffs, you know, because you can't get out because somebody pays the bills. And I just knew I never wanted to be that. So consequently, I'm single.
Well, I'm thinking back through the ladies in my family, my grandmother and my mother, and it's hard for me to say it was more difficult back then because I also have a background with volunteer work with CASA here locally. And I see the challenges that women have today. And somebody had mentioned earlier, there's a status to uphold now, and everything's very vibrant and vivid for people to criticize. Our suicide numbers are up, child abuse is up. So women are obviously still under some duress. So instead of saying it's harder back then or it's harder now, it's just different. I think being a woman is, you know, I know the question's about motherhood, but being a woman is just different. It was hard back then. Some of my grandmother's stories just crushed me, but then some of my own stories have crushed me too. And it's just different. I think we've had challenges through the years, and I know the challenges that I see now through my work and then my personal journey. It's just hard being a woman, and that's why it was so crushing for me to feel the criticism from other women over my decisions to be a mom or not, because I thought, well, gosh, I'm still a woman. I deserve a seat at the table, and this is hard stuff. Motherhood is difficult, womanhood is difficult, and we really need to work on being there for each other in any role that we choose to serve in. I think it's just difficult.
Absolutely.
Lacey, could you elaborate on some of the challenges that you see women facing today? Aside from the judgment and the input from the public at large through social media, is there anything else?
You bet. I'm thinking of my grandmother. She really only had one route in life. She had to grow up, get married, become a mom really early. She had 8 children. God love her. She was the sweetest woman. We lost her a few years ago, but that was her path in life. It was set out for her. She did it, accomplished. Where me, on the other hand, I've had nothing but opportunity. And there's still so much more I can do with my life that it almost gets stressful asking, have I done enough? Am I going to be okay? Was this enough? Am I going to be enough? Do I need to do more? And it was hard. It was really difficult for me in my journey to say, yeah, I'm enough. If I just sit in this chair right here and talk to you ladies and engage in conversation, that's enough. I don't need to go accomplish. But I think women and moms, especially, guys, it's hard on me when I hear my mom friends go at each other, judging how they're not breastfeeding. They are breastfeeding. They're going to homeschools. They're going to public school. Stop it. Yeah. It's been crushing for a woman in my position who didn't have children of her own, thinking, gosh, go take care. I know we're going to talk about self-care later, but please go take care of yourself and love on these babies that you've been gifted with. That's what we should be focused on. But the criticism and the judgment is still out there. So in that sense, Melissa, I think I do have it more it's different than what my grandmother had. I don't think she had this overabundance of opportunity. I think she did the best she could with what she had available to her. But women today, are we enough? If I just choose to be this, is that okay? I think we question that a lot.
Yeah. Well, I see that with, I've seen this kind of thing in the past with myself in my life and with a lot of my friends. There are times when I actually chose to be home full time when my kids were younger. And suddenly there was a lot of criticism for that. Well, you have a master's degree. What are you doing? Yeah. And then when I chose to go back to work, well, you still have kids at home. Cycle. We can't leave each other alone and say, this is your life and you need to live it the way you choose. And I need to support you in that, so yeah. It's just so important to let's just support each other and acknowledge that we all have our own path and say that all of those paths are equally valuable and valid.
Where did that criticism come from, Rebecca?
Sometimes from people online, from people who barely know you. I think that's something that happens a lot. People tend to feel like they need to tell you, this is what you should be doing. In fact, when I was dealing with infertility and I had one child, and I was thrilled to have this beautiful little girl. Someone actually approached me and my husband and said, "Isn't it time to have another kid?" And it floored me, because I thought, that's none of your business, and you don't know anything about me, and maybe this is painful for me because I'm actually trying to do that and it's not happening. I'm shocked that people still make those kinds of statements and judgments about other people.
Was that on Instagram or Facebook, or just somebody walking up to you in public, or?
It was in person, someone that we knew.
Wow.
And so that was when I made the decision at that point that I would never tell my children, okay, it's time to start giving me grandkids, because no, it's time for them to choose when to have children, if they're going to have children. And I've told them this is their decision. That just became very important for me to make sure that I was careful not to try to butt into someone else's personal business.
Well, it's very easy for people to give advice because they're not experiencing the consequences of taking that advice and following it to fruition, so they can say whatever they want.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
I'm going to bring up something along those lines, which is that the pressures that we're under, and my kids are now in their late 20s, early 30s, but I was raised in the 50s, and I could run around my neighborhood. My mom could be in the kitchen cooking. She was a stay-at-home mom, which was lovely. We had friends. The neighborhood was safe. I walked myself to grammar school. That did not happen when I raised children. The job got ever more busy, and the balance of life more difficult. To be raising your children safely, getting them where they needed to go, and then, as you've already brought up, all the pressures of what your child is supposed to be doing in terms of extracurriculars or any of that. All the variety of parenting books, of baby parenting books, infant parenting. And so just the social pressures of your peers, trying to become all of these things at once and do them, in the best possible way as everyone is learning together. And I found that to be, I would look at my mom's life and think that was so simple. She ran the home. Now, there's many people can complain about the 50s and the relationships in those marriages and things that were not so good. But my mom was an artist, and it worked for her. She, had a studio in the garage. And for some reason the other day, one of the things I remember about my childhood was that I was in the garage drawing with her, and I crumpled up my paper because I'd learned how to make a house at school or something. And she basically took it out of the garbage, flattened it out, and said, "You can make it however you like. You can keep working on it." And it just changed everything for me. And there were simple lessons like that, and I'm sure they are in all of our parenting lives.
I think, having the perspective of a lot of years, this is one of the few, if ever, times when parents had so little influence on their kids. My mom and dad were my world, and for a long time. But from the very beginning now, children are, especially if the parents both work, they're bombarded with TV, video, cell phone images, all of these different media, 24/7, what's going on in the world, nonstop, what's going on in the world. And I think that makes it very, very difficult. And peer pressure is a lot stronger now than it ever was. And I can say that as a school counselor for 25 years, I saw the evolution of kids going from, what will my mom say, what will my dad say, to what will my best friend say, or what will my girlfriend say. So it's really, really hard to raise kids with that strong, healthy, stable foundation that you want them to go into life with.
Yeah. I so agree. It is different.
I absolutely agree with that, because those influences really have changed the parents giving their children a sense of value and whatever their moral compass was, to that being influenced by so many other sources. Yeah. And you don't have the control that you used to have. The world isn't as safe as it used to be. You have to worry not just about the bully on the playground, but the cyberbully that you might not even know about.
Yeah, well, and I was just going to say that I think I've realized in the last 5-10 years or so that technology has been such a double-edged sword for all of us now, because it's allowed so many wonderful things, like what we're doing now. We're able to connect with each other, different parts of the world, and then share with other people, wherever they may be. But at the same time, as a speech pathologist, I've been seeing a lot of research come out in the last few years that's showing how so many parents are now giving their very young children technology at a very early age, handing their infants strapped into the cart a phone as soon as they can hold it to keep the kid happy in the store. And I do understand that. But at the same time, we're seeing a lot of problems with more and more kids being diagnosed with problems with language, communication disorders of various kinds. And they struggle when they get older to know how to have healthy relationships and just communicate with each other. There's this joke about how you'll see a group of teenagers and they're sitting by each other, but they're all looking down at their phones and they're texting each other. And I have literally seen that in schools where I've worked and in restaurants and different places. And it just kind of blows my mind. So we have this challenge of how do we deal with all of this? How do we balance it?
Rebecca, what does that do to their ability to communicate?
Well, when kids don't have this this interaction with another human being, when they're not learning how to actually look at another person and talk to them very early on, they're finding that causes a lot of problems. They may not even develop the vocabulary that they need. I was just reading a study that talked about how one of the most positive things parents can do if they're worried about their child's language and vocabulary development is just whenever you're with your child, just talk about what you're doing. Hey, we're going to go do dishes now. Can you help me? Let's pick up all the forks. And this has been shown time and time again to really, really boost a child's overall development linguistically and also just in their ability to interact with other people. And when kids are just left alone and you stick a tablet in front of their faces, they don't have those interactions with others. And it creates a lot of problems.
I have a sweet story related to what Rebecca was saying. I have 8 nieces and nephews too. I have 3 sisters and they all reproduce just fine. And I have 8 nieces and nephews, and I noticed some of them had their tablets all the time. So when I would go to visit, I was ready to communicate. I was ready to dive in because I don't have that in my home. And they just weren't interested in talking to Aunt Lacey. And so I started this thing where I started asking them questions. And just lots of questions. And at first they were like, Mom, Aunt Lacey asks a lot of questions. And they got used to it though. And one of their favorites still, now they're older, and we still ask, what's the coolest thing that's happened to you since I last saw you? And I hear them ask their parents that now, and they ask their kids that. So I like, if you ask about them, I think it'll help take them off their tablet. But I say this as an aunt, not a full-time mom that has them all the time. So I get that gets exhausting, but I like that I can maybe provide that motherly role from the aunt role to give my sisters a break and just have the conversations, because I agree with you, Rebecca. I think it's really hard when the tablet becomes the babysitter too much. I've noticed that the conversation is just not as, we all have to try harder to have that conversation with the kiddos.
So what do you do about all that? I mean, it's so hard, and some of that always ends up on the mother's, what do you do as a mother? I have a very short story. My son went off to college in Northern California, and I hadn't seen him for about 6 months, and I was so excited to go and visit him. And he was with 3 of his best friends, and we went to a restaurant to eat, and they were all sitting in the booth looking down at their phone. So I made them all put their phones in the middle of the table, face down. I said, okay, tell you what, all phones go down, and whoever picks their phone up first pays the bill.
I love it.
Down, you're taking, 4 20-something-year-olds out to eat and have a couple of beers. I mean, it gets expensive. And they were going, Dr. S, oh my God. I said, well, I want to hear about what's been happening the last 6 months. I said, no, pick it up. You pick it up, you pick up the bill. And I'm telling you, the first 10 minutes, they were so nervous because they could see, they had it on vibrate. They could see their phones vibrating, and they're all going, oh, is that my phone? I'm like, and after about 10 or 15 minutes, we were engaging in conversation. We were laughing. I was finding out about whose new girlfriend is doing what. And it was so fun.
It's interesting because I watch my daughter, because we're on quarantine like all of you. And she's 31. And she goes on house party now, which is her phone. But she's hanging out with her friends. They're talking. They're playing games. And so it's kind of fascinating because, oddly enough, the very tool that is annoying is now where they're being conversational. And
that's cool.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So this segues into the next question, which is, how can women practice self-care while still meeting the needs of their children, family, and friends?
I have to schedule it in. I absolutely have to put it on my schedule. And for me, self-care often involves writing. That just is something that really, really does me a lot of good. That's why I started writing fiction about 10, 12 years ago. And I'm fortunate to have a pretty supportive family. And so there are times when I say, I am gone this Saturday. I am taking my laptop. I am not going to be around. Please don't call me. And I have to make time for it.
Yeah, absolutely. You have to make a conscious decision to have time for yourself, whether it's going for a mani-pedi, having coffee with your best friend, or sitting at your laptop writing, just where no one's saying, mom, 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 mom. It just, I have to have that. Now I have it all the time, but before I literally had to schedule that in.
It's really, really hard when your kids are little.
Oh, yeah.
When you have a full-time career and you're raising 1, 2, 3 little kids, there is no time in the day for self-care. You're lucky to fall in bed at 11 o'clock at night. So, I mean, when they get older, you can do it. You can carve it out. But when they're tiny, you just kind of have to suck it up.
Absolutely. I didn't have any self-care when my son was little. I mean, I started to learn that as my practices were growing, and he was too. And all of a sudden I thought I was going to lose my mind if I didn't figure out a way to take some time for myself. But you're right. Under the age of 10, it's like full time. I don't think I ever even got a chance to take a nap. So, yeah.
Well, I think self-care is, it's different to different people and how we define it also. I know that when my son was younger, my self-care at time was certainly less, but I would consider self-care taking, a nice bath with bath salts, and just closing the door and knowing that somebody else was watching him for, 20 minutes so that I had a chance to regroup. But I can't remember who mentioned putting it on the calendar, but I absolutely think that if we're going to take care of ourselves, we have to put it on the calendar, and we have to realize that that appointment with ourselves doesn't get changed.
Right.
We need to have self-care. And, when we're taking care of ourselves, we are modeling for our children healthy behavior. And then we also have more energy for the people that we love and care about.
That whole thing, when you're on a plane, put your mask on first before you put your mask on your child. And it's really true, because if we're not good, nobody else is good. The husband, the kids, the work, nothing's good when you just feel completely depleted. So, yeah, I agree.
So true.
When my kids were young, and having 2, I remember with the first one, I would just take naps when she would take naps, because that was when I could at least catch up on some rest. Like if she fell asleep, I would just lie down and we'd both be napping. But by the time there was 2 of them, I think I invented this thing where we would just do yoga together. And, you know, that still required a lot of micromanaging of them. But over the years, you know, that was my self-care, but they were still in the room. And my life took a couple of turns. One was that I got divorced and then became a single parent, and that limits your time quite a bit. And I kept up with my yoga and reading and the baths, certainly. Like at night when I knew everybody was sleeping and I could just not worry about anyone else. But at 16, and this is what my book is about, my youngest daughter became ill. And so I was a single parent with a chronically ill child. And so self-care took another turn, which was more baths. And that was primarily my self-care. And I did this thing where I couldn't concentrate on anything else. And I just read romantic novels at night when I was super tired, but I just had to think about something else happening. And I never wanted to admit that as a writer because, you know, they're not literature, but it was like, these people are going to fall in love and something nice will happen. And I could go to sleep. And so that was my self-care.
You know, once again, it always seems to fall on the woman to take care of the home and the children and still have a career and figure out a time when, you know, this play date, when dinner's ready, going to the market, doctor's appointments. I mean, I think all women deserve Purple Hearts. I'm telling you. We do everything.
Yeah. Well, I heard someone recently talked about how as women, we wear lots of different hats, but she made the point that we do not have to wear them all at the same time. We should not expect that we have to do that. We need to be kind to ourselves.
Yeah.
I love that. Be kind to ourselves. That could be the center of self-care. For example, what you said, Susan, about make sure that this appointment is not canceled. Would that be kind to cancel it? No, follow through. Yeah, that's true. I like that.
Yeah, I think as women, we're often tempted to say, oh, well, I can do that later, or I don't have time for it today. And I think self-care needs to be essential.
Right.
Essential. That's true.
I tell my clients that it's, you don't want a 50% mom, you don't want a 50% employee, you don't want a 50% woman. It's a necessity. That's my belief. I wrote a whole book on it. The high performance detox is stepping off that stage of high performance. And it's the criticism I get toward, you know, Lacey, I don't have time. Lacey, you don't understand. I have little kids at home. It needs to be carved out. It needs to be an appointment. I have on my agenda, there's meetings that are literally a jog outside, or it's my own yoga practice, but it's a meeting that is just as important as a client call that I have right after it. It doesn't have to be an hour either. I tell some of my clients, if you can carve out 10 minutes, go do some breath work, go meditate, go sit in a closet in the dark and just hum to yourself. Do what you need to do for that little bit of kindness, and then hop back on stage as mom, as employee, as entrepreneur. My mother worked really hard with all four of us growing up, and I saw her never take a break, and it wound up hurting her health later in life. I still have her, thank goodness, but she's learned through the years that she's going to take time out for herself, and then we get her for longer, and that's a good thing.
That's a good thing.
Absolutely.
It's a lovely note to end on. Thank you for sharing, everyone. To all our viewers, don't forget to subscribe and also check out the panelists' YouTube channels linked in the description below. High Performance Detox, Josie, Dancing in the Narrows, Have You Seen These Children, The Grave Digger, and Another Cheesy Family newsletter are available on Amazon, links below, as well as links to each panelist's website. Thank you so much for being with us today.
Bye, everyone. Aloha.
Bye, everyone.
Thank you.